Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're really going to look under the hood of modern carbon offset projects. We hear so many buzzwords in this space, so we're getting right past all that and diving deep into the actual literal blueprint developers use to create high-integrity carbon credits. Specifically, we're unpacking the rigorous VM0047 methodology for ARR projects. And if you're wondering, ARR stands for Afforestation, Reforestation, and Revegetation. So if you've ever sat there and wondered, how do developers actually prove a newly planted forest is fighting climate change? Well, you're in exactly the right place. Let's dive right in. But hey, before we get into the heavy math and all those strict compliance rules, we need to anchor this highly technical methodology in its real, deep, emotional purpose. Troy Carter, the CEO of Earthshot Labs, really hit the nail on the head here. He points out that developing a VM0047 project is a tremendously complex, not to mention costly process. But the goal here isn't just about spotting a big market opportunity to make a quick buck. No way. It is fundamentally about generating real-world impact. It's about serving communities, restoring biodiversity, and delivering verifiable climate action at scale. And honestly, this ethos is exactly why the rules we're about to look at are so incredibly strict. So here's the project blueprint we're going to explore today. First, we'll look at stakeholders and FPIC. Then we'll move into navigating land eligibility rules. After that, we'll tackle the performance benchmark challenge. And finally, we'll wrap things up with calculating non-permanence risk. All right, let's start with Section 1, Stakeholders and FPIC first, building the human foundation. Let's actually test this out in the real world with a quick hypothetical. Say you're developing a carbon project. Which of these scenarios actually requires free, prior, and informed consent? You might hear this called FPIC. Do you need it for a privately titled cattle ranch that's just owned by a single family? Or what about state-owned land, where maybe some local farmers are encroaching on it? Or how about an area that's entirely governed by customary tenure? Any guesses? Well, the answer is that any project affecting land or user rights absolutely requires this consent. The crucial point to remember here is that FPIC isn't just for statutory, legally documented landowners. It applies heavily to customary rights holders too. We're talking about people who might traditionally use the land for hunting, fishing, or gathering materials, even if they don't hold a formal piece of paper saying they own it. To put that into perspective, customary rights holders make up an estimated 80% of landholders in Africa. That is huge. So you literally cannot establish a project start date, which means you cannot plant a single tree until this rigorous, ongoing consultation and approval process is completely and legally secured. But what happens when your proposed carbon project inevitably clashes with those existing local land uses? Well, developers have to follow a very strict mitigation hierarchy. Step 1, you must avoid negative impacts on land use entirely if possible. Like, if a community farms a specific plot, maybe you just exclude that plot from your project boundary altogether. Step 2, if impacts are truly unavoidable, you must minimize or mitigate them. And step 3, basically as a last resort, you must offset those impacts proportionally. Oh, and I should definitely add, forced displacement is literally never allowed under these rules. The human foundation has to be absolutely solid and equitable before anything else happens. Okay, moving right along, let's tackle Section 2, Navigating Land Eligibility Rules, the 10-year look back. So this methodology builds a really strict chronological compliance wall for developers, because to get a project approved, you don't just look at what the land looks like today, you actually have to look backward, 10 whole years backward, to be exact. At T-minus 10 years, developers must prove the land wasn't recently cleared or degraded just to generate carbon credits. Basically, they're trying to prevent perverse incentives, right? You can't just chop down a forest just so you can get paid to replant it. Makes sense. Then, moving forward on our timeline, we hit the pre-start phase, where you complete all your FPIC and stakeholder consultations. Only then do you reach the official start date, which is strictly defined as the exact moment when greenhouse gas removals begin, literally when the trees go into the ground. And finally, you have a hard deadline at year 3 to formally list your project. Now, even with all these strict rules, things can still get incredibly gray in the real world. Just consider this desert agroforestry dilemma from our source material. Imagine a desert landscape, right? Just some scattered shrubs. A developer comes along and wants to build an agroforestry project there, which is obviously going to require a lot of irrigation. So is that eligible under VM0047 as a reforestation project? Well, the fascinating truth here is that even the absolute top compliance experts argue this both ways. It is highly, highly ambiguous and honestly often just comes down to the subjective interpretation of the final auditor. And trust me, you don't want to spend months arguing with an auditor. So developers really have to over-prepare their evidence to prove this land wasn't just some native ecosystem that's being converted into a commercial plantation. All right, now we reach the most technical hurdle, Section 3. The Performance Benchmark Challenge. This is the math behind the trees. This really brilliantly illustrates the strategic chess game project developers are playing before they even write a single line of code. Over on the left, we've got the total dream scenario, high additionality and low leakage. Basically, this means the forest isn't regenerating on its own, so your trees are completely new additions for the climate, and there are no competing uses for the land. But let's be real, that's incredibly rare. Usually, if a forest isn't regenerating naturally, it's because humans are already using the land, often for cattle or agriculture. And that brings us to the right side of the scenario. If you plant trees there, sure, you have high additionality, but you also create high leakage. Why? Because those cattle ranchers don't just disappear, they usually just move right next door and cut down trees over there instead. And under VM0047, the deductions for this kind of leakage are absolutely massive. They can literally ruin a project financially if developers don't carefully design a rock-solid theory of change to mitigate it. So, how do you actually prove your project is working and generating new carbon removals? Well, VM0047 requires the use of something called a stocking index. You can kind of think of this as a financial audit, but for biology. It relies on advanced remote sensing metrics that correlate to actual above-ground biomass. It tells the auditors exactly how tree growth is changing over time in your specific project area. Basically, it serves as the ultimate, undeniable scientific receipt for the carbon credits you're planning to claim. But here's the catch. You can't just measure your own trees. You have to prove your trees are doing better than the land would have done without you there. To do this, developers have to track the stocking index of their project plots against completely independent control plots over 3 distinct historical time periods. We're talking 10 to 8 years ago, 8 to 1 year ago, and the actual year of the start date. And get this, there cannot be more than a 25% difference in the stocking index between your project plots and the matched control plots across these historical periods. It has to be a tight match, because if your control plots just randomly start regenerating on their own later on, well, your expected carbon credits basically drop straight to zero. Ouch. Honestly, navigating all this remote sensing data is a massive technical reality check. If you thought you could just fly a fancy camera drone over your forest, count some trees, and call it a day, yeah, think again. Under these rules, drones are actually not allowed for monitoring right now, unless you have peer-reviewed, published correlation papers proving that your specific drone imagery directly equates to actual biomass. Plus, basic satellite imagery, like standard NDVI, has some pretty significant limitations. Experts highly prefer NDVI data when measuring the forest canopy. And because the statistical matching of those control plots we just talked about is so unbelievably sensitive, I mean, just losing a few control plots to a random wildfire could completely ruin your project's data. Developers have to heavily iterate Python scripts to simulate endless what-if scenarios before they can even finalize their methodology. It's intense. All right, finally, let's look at the very last piece of the puzzle. Section 4, Calculating Non-Permanence Risk. This is all about protecting the ex ante pie. So after calculating the baseline, the additionality, and the leakage, developers finally come up with their ex ante estimated carbon removals. But hold on, they don't just get to keep all those credits. Before any credits are actually verified, developers have to deduct for non-permanence risk. This is the risk that the trees simply won't survive the mandatory 40-year project lifetime. You actually have to subtract portions of your total expected credits for internal risks, like maybe a lack of long-term landowner agreements, as well as external risks and natural risks. And because these deductions eat away at so much of the total expected credits, the smart developers out there simply assume a baseline 30% risk deduction right out of the gate when they're doing their early financial feasibility tests. Better safe than sorry, right? Now, what's really fascinating, and honestly kind of slightly ironic, is how you have to calculate that natural risk slice. To prove your forest will survive the next 40 years to fight climate change, you must mathematically model the future impacts of climate change itself on your project. No kidding. Developers are strictly required to use official IPCC data tools to model regional threats. You've got to account for sea level rise predictions, increasing drought probabilities, and even random fluctuations in cold spells. Global warming itself is literally calculated as a direct financial risk to the carbon project's survival. So what does this all mean? What should you really take away from all this? Why go through the crazy 10-year lookbacks, the intense community consultations for FPIC, the endless Python script iterations, and all that complex IPCC climate risk modeling? Well, it's because rigor creates trust. Methodologies like VM0047 are incredibly challenging, for sure, but they are what transform carbon offsets from just some dry, questionable compliance checklist into scientifically verified, undeniable climate action. It is absolutely this exact level of intense scrutiny that finally gives buyers and investors the real confidence that these trees are genuinely removing brand new carbon from the atmosphere. But as we look ahead to the future, I want to leave you guys with one final thought. We just saw that developers have to mathematically model the risk of future droughts and sea level rise, literally killing off their trees. So as climate change continues to accelerate, how on earth will these rigorous methodologies evolve to keep pace with the natural risks that are actively threatening our nature-based solutions? It's basically a massive strategic race between strict science and an unpredictable climate. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the science behind the solutions.